Started to say, and I noticed that my old boss at Madisonville Community College, Debbie Cox, is on the line, and she could testify to my strong or lack of belief in technology in higher education or in the classroom. But it is a wonderful opportunity, given everything that's going on in the world, that we could meet like this on Zoom. I have been very reluctant to get out and do in-person events. This was, set up about a year ago to be a book signing, and I wish I was there in Paducah to be with you. But this provides an opportunity for some people who are long distance away to be part of this talk. So I wanted to thank again Bill for his kind introduction. And this is the second time that I've spoken to the Jackson Purchase Historical Society during this project. In 2015, I had just completed an article for the Kentucky Historical Society Register. They did a 2-volume or a special 2-edition piece on Kentucky in the 20th century. And I wrote the article on Western Kentucky for that. And so I had a chance to talk about this project. At the time, I probably thought about finishing this book in 2 to 3 years. It's taken a little longer, and partly one of the things that came up over the course of the next 6 years, it looked like the University Press of Kentucky was on its last breath. Governor Bevin had zeroed out the appropriation to the University Press before he left office, and I was so happy to see the universities step up and help to make up the funding loss that the legislature cut out. And then normal things, peer review that you go through in writing a book for an academic press, caused delays. But the last 2 years with the virus gave me a lot of seat time. And over the course of that, I changed the direction in a big way. One of the readers, outside readers, suggested that I put too much emphasis, or too much. I was concentrating too much on developments in Washington and Frankfurt, and that I needed to turn my camera around, my lens around, to look at what was happening back in Western Kentucky, which I did. I discovered, and I greatly appreciated, newspapers online. I think when I die, I'm going to leave whatever money I have left to that. Newspapers online allowed me searchable access to the Paducah Sun Democrat, the Owensboro papers, Madisonville papers, and several others that I found very, very useful. And it really changed, I think, in a very positive way, the final product. Let me, if I could indulge you for a second, I'd like to share a story from this story comes from what was called the Good Roads movement of the pre-First World War period. The Good Roads people were advocating for, well, better roads in not only Kentucky, but throughout the country. And anyway, there was a story that kind of goes like this, that two farmers met one day on the road that passed by their homes, and it had recently rained, so the hole that they were standing nearby had turned to a big mud puddle. And on top of this mud puddle, they spy a man's hat. So one of the farmers gets his fishing rod and casts his line in to try to retrieve this hat. As he begins reeling the hat in, a man's head suddenly appears. And the farmer says, "Why, you poor fellow, you are in an awful fix." And the fellow that is emerging says, "Well, I don't mind it very much." The man he replied calmly, "But it is pretty hard on my horse." And the point of the story, I don't know if it translates to the 21st century, but I wanted to kind of establish that Western Kentucky, at the start of my period, which is the beginning of the New Deal, was really closer to the 19th century in so many ways. Roads. I have a map in my book that I very much like. It's a reproduction of a 1931 Kentucky road map, and if you could see it, you would see that virtually there are no hard surface roads in Western Kentucky. What we know is U.S. highways, and by 1931 we did have U.S. highways in Western Kentucky, but they were mainly gravel and dirt roads. Okay, so people back then talked about being in the mud, and then if you look at other measures, very few people in rural Kentucky had electricity. Telephones were rare in many homes. Of course, no air conditioning. So in so many ways, Western Kentucky was much closer at that time to the 19th century. By the time I finish, my story sort of ends in the mid 1990s. We had not only gone through transistors, but we were already into microchips, and so the hard surface roads. Everybody has electricity. Many people are starting to have home computers, air conditioning in most homes. Western Kentucky goes through a pretty dramatic change over that basically 60-year period. I'd have to say, that one of the, I saw this as a possible book many years ago. I was still working in Oklahoma, where I worked as the research director for the Oklahoma House of Representatives, and I had worked on a number of research projects back there. But my wife and I had plans to move back to Western Kentucky, and I saw that there was a real opportunity, I felt, for a book dealing with Western Kentucky. There's almost nothing published on what I term Western Kentucky, and yet what was so strange is that in terms of politics, Western Kentucky produced a number of very important political figures. And Bruce, if I could call on you, you might bring up some of my slides here. one of the first figures that I deal with is the man on the left in the open car. Everybody should recognize the man on the right there waving his hat. That's Franklin Roosevelt. To the left is Ruby Laffoon from Madisonville. And of course, he was governor from 1931 through 1935. And I tend to treat him as, I think I give him a more favorable treatment than a lot of historians. Historians have viewed his term in office as a failure, largely because his efforts to get a state sales tax, ended up being overturned very quickly. And if you want to go to the next slide. Okay, here's a picture of Laffoon again. And if you could, he's sort of in the left, center left. The man standing to the right is a figure you may recognize. That's Happy Chandler, who was Laffoon's lieutenant governor. A couple of remarkable things is the age difference. You could see, Laffoon is considerably older, looking more tired. This was actually from the inauguration, but the story goes around about Happy Chandler is that he was so eager to be on the ticket in 1931 that he had to kneel down and beg Laffoon to allow him to run with Laffoon as lieutenant governor. I don't know how true that is, but that's a story that goes around in Hopkins County anyway. But the two men over the course of the Laffoon administration end up being bitter political enemies. Chandler fought at every turn Laffoon's efforts to pass the sales tax. Laffoon, despite looking so tired here, was a determined governor, and finally, before he leaves office, gains control of the legislature, gets his sales tax passed, and appeared to have a very strong hand over Kentucky politics. Thomas Ray was not Happy Chandler, but Thomas Ray from Russellville was Laffoon's choice to replace him. And I kind of had to laugh. Henry Ward, who I'll talk about several times over the course of this morning. Henry Ward was a young state legislator from Paducah, also was a reporter for the Paducah Sun-Democrat, remarked after the passage of the sales tax that Chandler's political career was dead. That says something, I guess, about Henry Ward as a political prophet. Any case, it appeared that Laffoon had a plan to hold a Democratic convention to pick the candidate to run after him. And governors at that time, of course, could only serve one term. But with Laffoon's control of the Democratic Party, the convention would almost assuredly had allowed him to name his successor. Well, Laffoon makes a mistake, goes to Washington, and as soon as he crosses the state line by rail, Happy Chandler stepped in, called a special session to try to get a primary. A big fight ensues. Happy Chandler wins. The court said, well, he was acting governor and he was within his legal rights to call the special session. And out in the countryside, there was strong support for a primary. So a primary is held. Chandler runs against Laffoon's chosen successor, Tom Ray. Ray wins in the initial primary, but in a runoff primary, Chandler defeats Laffoon and goes on to have a very successful career. One of the first things that Chandler did, and one of the things he was mostly consistent about, over his career was his opposition to the sales tax. So one of the things he used to run against Tom Ray in the campaign was that, if he was elected, he would repeal the sales tax, which he did. Okay, next slide. Okay, here's another important political figure, or two actually, from Western Kentucky. The man in the center is Earl Clements from Morganfield. He was governor from 1947 to 1950, and then U.S. Senator until 1956. Standing to the right of him, or to your right, I guess, is Henry Ward, who was his conservation director. And Henry Ward is a very important figure. In fact, that's the subject of the article that I'm expected to have in the upcoming issue of the journal. As I've got an article on Henry Ward, and Henry Ward is very, very important in Western Kentucky as the father of Kentucky State Parks, and as a major figure in the development of our state road system. Okay, Bruce, you can go to the next slide. Okay, here's another picture of Happy Chandler, and he was not only governor from 1935 through 38, but of course he was U.S. Senator for a number of years, and then he came back for a second term in 1955. A little fun here is the man to his right is somebody that is distantly related to me, Robert Humphreys. Never had heard of him, but he was raised in the same small community in Hickman County, Fulgham, that my grandfather was from. And Robert Humphreys was Chandler's right-hand man as campaign chairman. He was known as Mr. Democrat. Many years he served as the head of the Kentucky Democratic Party. He was 2 times state highway commissioner, and he replaced Alvin Barkley for a brief period when Barkley died in 1956. So that's my cousin Bob. Go ahead, Bruce. Okay, this slide, the man sitting to our right at the table is Governor Ned Breathitt from Hopkinsville. Very important governor. But I'm going to spend a little time on the woman to the left. One of the things I regret is that I do not have as many women in my book as I wished I could, but that was the nature of politics at the time. But this woman her name is Kathleen Peden. She's from Hopkinsville as well. She was a classmate of Ned Breathitt, and she was a very strong, important political figure in her days. She elbowed Harry Lee Waterfield out. Harry Lee Waterfield was lieutenant governor during the Breathitt administration, and Waterfield wanted to take the lead on economic development, which was one of the charges that Kathleen Peden had, and she bested Harry Lee Waterfield in that regard. And she ran a very strong campaign in 1968 for U.S. Senator, losing in a bad year for Democrats, but she performed very well. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is Wendell Ford from Owensboro. Wendell Ford was governor, of course, from 1971 through 1975, and then later U.S. Senator. He's sitting at his desk trying to respond to what was a series of tornadoes at the time. He's manning the desk, barking out orders, I guess. So, and next slide. Um, One of the things, since you all, many of you are connected to the Jackson Purchase, one of the sore spots for the Jackson Purchase was that the area had never had a governor up until 1975. Jackson Purchase was reliably Democratic area, but several Jackson Purchase political figures had run for governor, including Alvin Barkley in 1923, and Harry Lee Waterfield in 1947, Harry Lee Waterfield again in 1959, Henry Ward in 1967. All of them ran strong campaigns, but failed to win the governor's chair. This is something, a campaign thing that I picked up from Western Kentucky University. Ford and Julian gosh, I knew they'd do this. Somebody could help me. Oh, Julian Carroll, I'm sorry, from Paducah, were actually political enemies. In the 1971 primary, Ford ran a very difficult race against his old boss, Burt Combs. And anyway, Julian Carroll aligned himself with Combs as lieutenant governor, and made both Wendell Ford and his political confidant, J.R. Miller, very upset. And so there was never any close feelings between the two men. But anyway, when the opportunity came up, a vacancy came up for the U.S. Senate, Julian Carroll convinced Wendell Ford and the other key figures in the Democratic Party who would be the best interests of the party if Ford was to step down and allow Julian Carroll. So that's 1970, 75, or actually I guess 1974 is the first and only time that the Jackson Purchase had somebody in the governor's chair in Frankfort. So anyway, I'd like to spend a few minutes just talking about a couple of things that I encountered along the way. One of the more interesting considerations that I had to face was what to include in Western Kentucky. I found that there was a great number of different efforts to try to present what I call Western Kentucky. And I had people that disagreed with me, including Warren County, to which I said, well, so long as Western Kentucky University is in Bowling Green, I feel like Western Kentucky needed to include Bowling Green. I even had some people that disagreed with me including the Jackson Purchase in Western Kentucky. But again, that just didn't make sense. So to me, what I defined Western Kentucky is starting from the eastern border, going down through Hancock, Ohio, Butler, Warren, and Simpson County. That represents about 28 counties, 28% of the state's land mass, and approximately 17 or 18% of the state's population. As I think that as Bill mentioned, Western Kentucky was the strongest, most blue part of Western Kentucky. This slide kind of tells a story. It looks at the general elections from 1927 to 1959, and in the second column, you can see that essentially, if a Democrat couldn't win Western Kentucky by, I would say, at least 50,000 votes, uh, they were going to have a very difficult time winning. In fact, I've concluded that, there's a way of looking at Kentucky, not so much as a Democratic state in those days, but that we were basically a toss-up state, with, if you pulled out Western Kentucky. So from, if you look at Ruby LaFoon's, Happy Chandler, King Johnson, Earl Clements, you look at all these Democratic winners, their majorities in the races, had to be nearly about 50. Western Kentucky was about 50% of the Democratic majority in their November elections. Okay, this certainly changes, and I say, I locate the change in 1994. That was that particular year. Both the first and second congressional districts, which had been forever Democratic, both, that year, both congressional districts, elected Republicans, and have been in the hands of Republicans ever since. I think Bill alluded to, well, why the change? How do you explain the change? And I'm not sure I have the answer. I have an answer. And a lot of people will say, well, it was civil rights. They go back to the 1955 or 1954 Brown decision, and then, go a little bit further, the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, LBJ's comments that passage of those bills effectively gave the South to the Republican parties, for, in the future. And I tend to not agree with that position, because you're talking about, if that was the case, why did it take so long for Western Kentucky to become Republican? We're talking 40 years. I tend to see the change as more incremental, and really the change is focused on the divisive social issues of our time. The slogan, God's, guns, and gays. And I kind of look at what happens in the 1960s, with Supreme Court rulings ending prayer in school, followed by the Equal Rights Amendment, and the Kentucky was an early in terms of ratifying the ERA, and then opposition, particularly strong in Western Kentucky, and centered in Owensboro and Mayfield. But there developed a very strong movement to rescind the vote on the ERA, which ultimately was passed, and then that led straight into abortion and a number of other issues, homosexuality, gay rights, gun rights, and on and on. And I think that tended to be the cause or causes for the shift, so that by the time that I finish up in the 1994, and many of you could have probably heard this, that the idea that you can't be a Christian and a Democrat, or that I didn't leave the Democratic Party, it left me. That's a general feeling, I think, among many in Western Kentucky, and that has continued to today. I'll just say a couple of more things. I think that I've been generally pleased with the reception to my work, and I'm hoping that that others will see that the emphasis on regional history is very valid. I think that in many cases that the failure to look at the differences between our regions, skews Kentucky history. One of the things that, if we talk about, the Civil War and Reconstruction, and, the old line that comes from Professor Colton, is the idea that Kentucky became Southern after the Civil War, that we were one of the only societies that ever joined a lost cause after the cause was lost. And I think that, work by people like, Barry Craig and several others have proved that in the case of at least the Jackson Purges, that the Jackson Purges was Confederate long before Kentucky, moved over into the opposition to the Union cause. And I think we see, there's a number of places where we have histories written on Kentucky tobacco that's written from the point of view of that excludes, I guess, experience in our dark fire tobacco. And I think Bobby Smith Bryan is on this call, and I think she's very provides a lot of information about the importance of dark fire tobacco. And so anyway, and I'm going to kind of turn it back over for questions and answers.
George, this is Bill. I'm Mulligan. Are there any individuals whom you would see as being more significant in the transition than others? Did it just happen sort of from the grassroots up, or were there politicians looking to focus on these issues as a way to gain control for the Republican Party?
I tend to see it, more from the grassroots. You take the ERA, and I spent, there's others have spent more time on this than I have, but that there were these grassroots organizations that formed in throughout the state, but particularly in Western Kentucky, like I said, around Owensboro and Mayfield, that put pressure, and in many cases, politicians who had voted for the ERA, and then we're talking, about 6 years that it took to finally, vote for rescinding the ERA. But many who had voted for it reversed themselves over time and voted for rescission. Now there were several politicians that comes to mind. Lloyd Clapp from Wingo, a longtime House member who was very active, but he also, he lived in the Mayfield area, and so again, again, the connection there. But Lloyd Clapp was a political leader in that effort. But so I tend to see it more from as a grassroots type of thing.
One other, I guess, thing that pops into my mind, I believe there are still more registered Democrats in Kentucky than Republicans.
Yeah.
And the transition seems to have occurred at the national level rather than at the state level. Is that just a superficial view, or is there some substance there?
Well, of course, in terms of registration, until recently, any number of people will tell me that when they went to register to vote, that they perhaps thought about registering as independent or Republican, but when they registered, the election official, would kind of raise their eyebrows and say, "Are you sure?" Because until recently, you virtually had to be a Democrat if you were going to, have a voice in the primaries until 10 or 15 years ago. That's where the local elections were decided. Does that help? So I guess, we have a lot of legacy Democrats who are still registered as Democrats. Some of them, now moving over to the Republican Party.
This is Bruce Dobbins. I'll add an interesting story. The chair of the Republican Party for a while was across the street from the church I last served, and she asked me to pray, and I went and prayed over the Republican thing. It was when I say I came across the aisle and they all booed me, but McConnell was on my left, right. But she was telling me her story that when they moved to Mayfield, she went up to register at the courthouse. And she said, I want to register. And she said, well, if you don't register Democrats, you're not going to be voting in any primaries. And she said that made her mad. So she registered Republican just to go against the grain. So that was actually the story that had happened. We have Bobby. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question? Unmute, please.
Sure. I just wanted to add, George, you might want to mention the influence that the newspaper editors had on campaigns as well. I thought that was a nice aspect that you added in the book.
Time, of course, back in the 1920s, 1930s, the newspapers in the region were largely, I mean, they were, self-proclaimed Democratic organs. They represented the interests of the Democratic Party. Of course, that's no longer true. And the Paducah Sun Democrat is now the Paducah Sun, and of course the Paducah, Paxton group owns what the Paducah, the Owensboro, the Madisonville papers, plus several other smaller papers. I think they exercise a pretty strong editorial line in the Paducah paper, not so much maybe in Owensboro or Madisonville as in Paducah, but newspapers have changed. They're no longer, they're reluctant to write political, to endorse people as they once did, and one of the sad stories, I think, and somebody needs to write this, is the newspapers, as an opinion leader, has diminished so much. When I came back to Kentucky in 2004, and Penny Miller, who wrote a political and a historical book on Kentucky, talked about the things that unite Kentucky, and it was University of Kentucky basketball, KET, and the Courier Journal. The Courier Journal changed, but shortly after I came back, the Courier Journal used to have bureaus in the eastern and western part of the state, and now it's so focused on what happens in Jefferson and neighboring counties. And this has been replicated in Owensboro. Owensboro had a desk here in Muhlenberg County where I live, and that's no longer the case. And I think it's probably true in Paducah, that these important, sources for opinion have become so localized. And one of the things I was thinking about, and I just didn't have the time to get into it, but when I turned to see what was happening at the local level, what I was really impressed by was the civic engagement, the local groups that work so hard for getting TVA, cheap public power in the region, or improving roads, getting state parks, these freeing the tolls on bridges. That was a big thing in the 1930s and 1940s. Any case, I don't see that same level of civic engagement today. The emphasis, the emphasis on divisive social issues. I don't see the Western Kentucky Political Caucus as taking a leadership role as they perhaps should be in terms of improving matters here in Western Kentucky.
Hi, I'm Brent Taylor. Uh, I was kind of curious about the Republicans in the 20s. I had noticed that they were fairly strong prior to the Great Depression. Is is that the sort of thing that you saw as making a comeback after the Depression era with the Republican resurgence, or something else?
I'm sorry, I couldn't get that. You're cutting in and out on me.
Okay, so in the 1920s, the Republicans had appeared to be gaining momentum in the state.
Oh, yes, okay.
Then the Depression happened.
Yeah.
So then once the Depression was over, was it that kind of 1920s Republican Party that was making a comeback, or was it something else?
Well, what you see is as strength in the 1920s. And if Dwayne Bolden was on the line, he could help me with this. But there was a political bossism. Kentucky from in those days was to a large extent run by the political or the economic interests of the state. And there was a bipartisan combine that actually backed Governor Flem Sampson in the 1927 election. And so it was, it wasn't the Republican Party per se. It was, the combined interest of the political vested interest, I guess, in Kentucky that helped elect him. But yeah, by 1931, with the Depression, the Republican Party was pretty much dead. Here, and of course, in 1932, that was the case across the nation.
Parker.
Hello, I'm Richard Parker, Vice President of the Society.
Yes.
So my question is, I was curious to the influence Alvin Barkley had on actual, not handpicking candidates, but endorsing candidates from DC. Did that occur any?
Of him, Barkley sort of stood aside. Democratic politics in the period I'm looking at, or at least up until the 1970s, was bifactional. And Barkley, during, of course, he was gone after 1956, but Barkley tended to stand outside of the factions, or stood above it. Now he did get very involved. One of the things we could have talked about was 1938 senatorial election, one of the more important elections, where Barkley, as incumbent U.S. senator and as Senate Majority Leader, runs. Happy Chandler, the incumbent governor, ran against him for U.S. Senate that year, and I'd say there was never any loss of, or there was not a great deal of love that existed between Chandler and Barkley. And Barkley, I think, deviated from his reluctance to get involved in primaries in 1955 when he campaigned against Happy Chandler and for Burt Combs. But so he was not what I would consider a kingmaker, in the sense that, say, Earl Clements or Smith Broadbent from Cadiz, or J.R. Miller from Owensboro, or Doc Beecham from Russellville. Those are all Western Kentucky, what you would call kingmakers. But I don't think of Barkley in that same vein.
Interesting. Yeah, I was just curious too. I was trying to make a connection when you were talking about there was, no governor besides Carroll from the Purchase area, and I was just curious. I would think
in 1923, and he ran a credible, strong contest. But my reading of that is that this bipartisan combine, the horse racing, coal, and other economic interests in the state, liquor interests, because Barkley was during that period for prohibition, but they were reluctant to get behind Barkley, and probably was just as glad to see him go off to the U.S. Senate.
How you doing?
Hurts. I have a question for you. One of the things that I thought was really interesting is that it seems like in the last couple of decades that we've elected Republicans at the federal level, but still elect Democrats to constitutional offices in Kentucky. So while you might have a Mitch McConnell and a Jim Bunning in Washington, or even your congressman might be a Republican like Whitfield or Comer was, you'd still elect a Brereton Jones or Paul Patton or even a Steve and Andy Beshear. And you'd also elect, like Bill Clinton would win the state. So it's interesting to me that like you have Democrats even winning in the Electoral College while at the same time electing and re-electing consistently people like McConnell and Jim Bunning. Why do you think that is?
I think that's not the normal case, but I do note that, or I did note in my research that in the case of particularly Steve Beshear, that Beshear did exceedingly well in Western Kentucky, and I attribute that to poor candidates that the Republicans, Ernie Fletcher, and had become very unpopular in his one term as governor, and so Beshear is won all but Butler County in what I call Western Kentucky in that campaign, and then David Williams was not a very popular figure, and so again Beshear swept Western Kentucky, and even in the case of Andy Beshear, of course Steve Beshear is from Dawson Springs, so that didn't hurt him in Western Kentucky, and his son Andy, although he didn't win in Western Kentucky, ran pretty well. And again, I think Beshear benefited from a very, running against a very unpopular Republican incumbent. If the Republicans could put up, candidates who are popular, I think that for the foreseeable future, I don't know that the Democrats can run strong in Western Kentucky. Western Kentucky has one Democrat in the General Assembly. That's Patty Minter from Bowling Green. Only one. We had a series of conversations. He noted a couple of weeks ago that in the case of the Jackson Purchase, not one Democrat filed for any of the open legislative seats in the Jackson Purchase. It's a little better over in this part of Western Kentucky, but on the whole, even getting viable candidates to run, for the General Assembly in Western Kentucky is difficult.
This is Bruce Dobbins again. It's just interesting to note that Democrats, the few of us that are down there in Mayfield, Graves County, last election we had two or three people in our county level ran as Democrats, and as soon as they got elected, changed to Republican. And boy, does that make a party upset. We help you get elected, and then you abandon this kind of thing. And we virtually don't have anybody in the county left, I think, Democrat. Everybody's gone Republican, and even having trouble getting a Democrat to even be seated on the election board, which is mandatory. And everybody else is a Republican on it, the sheriff and everybody's involved. So it gets a little scarier at times, because that huge county had something like 25, 30 precincts. We're going to 6. So if you don't have a vehicle to get around, it's, again, trying to take away voting rights from people. And it was questioned, and basically our Democratic candidate on that board at that time, the election board, was told to shut her mouth and not to make it public. Because it was very interesting. She was just kind of almost beat down by every Republican in this county. that don't disrupt the process. And we got to questioning whether the election board
Suspect
was actually
if
in
you
open
surveyed
meetings.
Western Kentucky in terms of
You're on there,
executives,
can
that the
you
majority of
open your
them are
mouth about what
Republican.
goes
Now,
on?
you know,
And I
know
never did
here,
find
still in Muhlenberg
anything from the
County,
election board statewide or any
that,
place else as we looked at that,
a number
that could
of
answer that
the,
question.
of our
You know,
county
does the
level
election boards in the
offices,
county have
Republicans
the
did
right
not
privilege of not
field
saying anything to
candidates, which
public
really
until
surprised
they get it
me,
back
but,
from the state and all
yeah.
that? So
I think
if anybody's got an
that's-
answer out there for me,
that's
Bruce would like to
not the
know.
normal situation.
When I gave that prayer for the breakfast before Fancy Farm for the Republicans and said I stepped across the aisle and got booed, before I did my prayer, and I said Alexander Campbell was an active politician at the founding of our church. It was interesting after I sat down, Governor Bevin pointed me out and said, "It's never the wrong time to do the right thing, Pastor Dobbins, become a Republican." Well, everybody in the room cheered and I just, okay, whatever, you know, but it was funny. I kind of did that because of knowing how the congregation was, that, you know, I can step across the aisle and do some things, can't you, once in a while? Because, you know, very hardcore conservatives in their religious beliefs as well as their political. And a lot of them were shocked to death. You went and prayed over the Republicans? Well, they're people too. God loves them somehow. I'm not sure how, but